Hello, hello, hello. Hello, hello. Welcome everyone. We're just gonna let people in and we'll start it in just a minute. With its fun non-copyrighted music in our background.
Original.
It'd be lovely to get a little geo check in the chat. You're great to see where people are waking up or.
Got some bonjour in there.
Oui.
Scotland. Oh, now we're gonna have to see some more non-copyright music. See what comes up. Maybe we can use that as our cue to kick things off away from the copyrighted music. Go for
I
it.
was just going to say that if there's any musicians in the room that would like to gift some cool music to the Commons for these events, that would be awesome.
So welcome everyone to technically our fourth, but really originally our third Greater Than talk, which we had to rearrange because of the fact that I am extremely honored to have three brilliant women who are in three different continents. And despite us being super self-organized and, you know, whizzes of many things, time zone changes that change at different times in different months of the year is still really a difficult one for us to crack. But we're really grateful that you waited with us. So without much further ado, I just feel so honored to be able to share an hour with our three guests, Susan Basterfield, Lisa Gill, and Samantha Slade. I'm not really sure that these amazing women really need much of an introduction, and to kind of really honor our desire and our constant intention to walk the talk, I'd rather pass the mic to them and allow them to introduce themselves and actually more importantly, introduce each other. Like I said, we're across three different continents. So I'd love to hear how it is that this constellation came to be. Sam, I'm going to pass the mic over to you because you're the person I actually don't know, whereas I work with Susan and Lisa very, very closely. So I'd love to hear how you met these two humans and how your explorations came to be interwoven.
Yeah, I'd love to start. So earlier on today, I went back to my emails to find my very first email from you, Susan, 5 years ago. You wrote me, as you do down there in New Zealand. You reach out to the world as you stalk people online. And those of us who are lucky enough to be actually documenting our work and putting it out into the world, yay, you found me on Medium, you read an article, you wrote to me, something very like light and sassy, and let's just check in together and see what each of us is doing. And we did that, and it was so much fun and so much sync in it, because it wasn't, honestly, 5 years ago, wasn't a whole lot of people working in these spaces. So there was the two of us out in the world. And right away, like within a week, you invited me to said, hey, Sam, I've been with this other group of people, some Canadians, and we were looking at putting in a proposal for next year's South by Southwest in 2017, that was going to be. And right away, I jumped on board, and it took me a little bit of time to figure out that though you were organizing a panel on participatory organizations at South by Southwest, you had no intention of going. And I was like, wow, talk about purpose driven. You were like, I want this to be talked about in the world. I want people to learn about it. I don't necessarily need to be the one. And so you wanted organizations that were practicing, and you were like, your co-op, Percolab, is practicing. You just go and tell your stories. And I am a kind of a shy person, so I need people like you, give a little bit of kick in the butt and like get us out on a stage. And so that was our first like encounter at that point. So I still hadn't really met you in person, but we were already collaborating on a project in the States without either one of us being there. And then very shortly after, I invited you to work with the HR chartered organization here in Montreal in Canada. And we did some really sweet workshop stuff on the future of work. And that was back in 2017. And it took a little while for me to meet up with Lisa, because that was, I think, Lisa, tell me when we met up. It was from your podcast.
We met first virtually on my podcast a few years ago. And then like 2 years ago, I came and did the Going Horizontal training with you outside Barcelona and got to spend a whole weekend with you and kind of diving into that world, which was really fun.
That was great. That was like in some beautiful place, like just like heaven on earth outside of Barcelona. That was I think the Going Horizontal book hadn't even launched. It was just about to launch, and the University of Barcelona already accepted to offer certified training in their continuing education department. And so it was really great, and I was thrilled because it was like, wow, an official university is like going out and going to be officially acknowledging and certifying people that are coming to this training. And then in that training, we got participatory and opened it up to the participants, and you jumped in and gave like a workshop. There was a room and no chairs on feedback, right?
Yeah, some feedback speed dating.
Yeah, that was really great. Yeah. And so I'm wondering how you and Susan met. Like, I'm guessing it's online stalking, but maybe not.
I think it was a little bit of mutual stalking through an amazing fellow from the UK called Perry Timms. He was running a Google group. Do you remember what it was called, Lisa?
iPractice.
The iPractice, yeah. And I had recently fallen in love with liberating structures, and I kept on seeing posts from this woman, Lisa Gill, who was melding sort of the reinventing organizations, liberating structures world. And I'm like, I need to know this human. So I did, as you said, Samantha, what I do, just write an email cold and say, I think you're cool. Can we chat? And yeah, that's how Lisa and I met. And I think that was probably also in late 2015, early 2016. And yeah, and we just before we met, I don't know, just fell into this rhythm of having calls every month, a little bit tentatively because we didn't quite know each other yet. And just found, like you said, that synergy of both exploration and generosity. And then I guess it was later in 2016 that I had my first lunch with Lisa and our other collaborator, an amazing human, Tom Nixon, in Victoria, in London somewhere. And it's just gone from strength to strength with my relationship and friendship with Lisa. And yeah, it's just like you said, Samantha, 5 years ago, there weren't that many of us in the world. And now I'm just like watching the tick over of people joining this call, right? We're up to 128, 130. We had over 500 sign up, which is like blows my mind that there are so many humans now that have been working in this space and have become interested in not only how to start, but to start to learn the lessons of those of us who have been practicing and eating our own monkey food for 3 or 4 or 5 years now. Lisa, what's kind of your origin story of this constellation and you starting to do this work in the world?
Yeah, well, I think I like to say that I was a frustrated employee for a while, and really, I think the impetus for me leaving the corporate world and setting up my own company was just that I was constantly in different industries noticing how little autonomy I had to influence things and be creative, even though I was often working in creative industries like the arts or media and stuff. And yeah, you and I connected over a love of liberating structures. And I think what people always tell me about this movement, this kind of new ways of working movement, is people are always struck by how generous and abundant people are in this space. So I think we are a great example of how, you know, in a traditional paradigm, I guess we might look at each other as competitors, but from the very beginning, we've all kind of shared with each other, you know, what are you working on? What are you learning? I'm working on this project. Oh, that's exciting. And we've collaborated on things. And each of us now, even though we're working in, you know, 3 different continents, in different, I think with different lenses and different approaches, we've all published books. I think we're all really interested in sharing stories and examples and walking the talk and sharing, you know, warts and all stories as well. Like these are the things that are challenging, and, you know, hence this topic of pitfalls, which for me is really energizing, because I think if we can help people navigate, you know, there's no one path, right? But if we can help people, if we can shine a light on some of the common pitfalls, some of the common challenges, and make people's journeys a little easier, or kind of help people feel like, you know, there is a tribe, there's a group of people doing this work, you're not alone. And if you're struggling with this, there's, you know, it's human and it's natural and we're all finding our way, then I think that's really worth doing.
Yeah. The word I like to use is sister companies instead of competitors. It's the word that just, since the very first time it just popped out of my mouth, it's stuck, right? And I often talk about the international community as a lot of sister companies in the field. And I have a lot of respect, because it's like people who are, it's, you know, there's some, I'm going to put pioneering because it's a bit of a colonial term, but it's, you know, we're breaking ground in the work because the systems aren't set up just to naturally go the way we're functioning. And yet we're functioning this way anyways, because I don't think any of us could function otherwise. It's kind of in our bodies that we want to function like this. And so what I like about it is, it's really creative. So I feel like in the kind of the emergent space of it, a lot of people who've initially got in are really kind of avid learners. Like we're all passionate about learning and we're all very creative. And then there's that generosity of like, if you're creative and you like learning, well, then you like sharing and thinking out loud and thinking together, right? And I think that's one of the pieces that connects the 3 of us in here. And so with the topic today, I like said yes to the invitation right away with an expectation, because I know it's the 2 of you. It means we'll be talking about the topic in general, pitfalls of self-management. And then I knew we'd be talking about ourselves in our own personal explorations, past and present, around that. And I think the idea of it being both, like this impacts me as a human being and an individual while I try to change systems, and working on those 2 spaces is also common to each of us.
Yeah, I think I'd almost like to start from there, kind of like to ground us in this question of pitfalls. Like, as you were starting on these journeys, what are the first pitfalls that you encountered? Like, what were the first things you were like, oh, wow, that wasn't as I expected, and I kind of fell down that trap?
There's so many. It's like, wait, how many do you start? I'll start with one little tiny one that's like so easy and evident, is like you set things up so that everybody can participate, but then everybody doesn't start participating. And you're like, why not? And it's because just because you set it up and you think that everybody understands that implicitly or informally does not mean it's going to happen. And time and time again, I see people like the same one that I did, thinking that we're all going to participate just because there are no barriers to participation. But the no barriers is not enough, because you have to deconstruct habits and paradigms and all that stuff. So you got to scaffold it and you've got to make it explicit.
Yeah, absolutely. Creating equitable access to the center or to the organization certainly does not mean that people are going to necessarily share the same energy for the same work that everybody else does, right? It's like I say quite frequently that don't expect, just because you are taking the bold step to really take a look at the structures and systems under which you're operating, to interrogate them so that you can have some options to change them, that everybody in the organization will want to participate in that journey or in that endeavor. It's kind of paradoxical, but I think that I see that time and time again. And I think that part of that for me, what I've learned in my lived experience is that the cultural practices that the organization starts to unearth for themselves is the leading behavior. Tools can help sometimes with the communication and I guess organization, but don't expect for tools to solve your problems, right? Loomio is an amazing tool for creating the conditions for dialogue and making proposals, waiting for those proposals to ripen, and then somebody actually raising the proposals so that we can see what the energy or the consent for the particular proposal is. But unless you have a culture of making proposals and deciding together, a tool isn't going to make that happen.
Yeah, I just want to pick up a comment in the chat here that I really resonate with and was actually going to chime in with, which is that when a lot of like CEOs or founders complain to me and say like, hey, I announced self-management. Why aren't people stepping in? Why is no one participating? What's the deal? Do people just need to be told what to do? And something I'm really learning is that everyone goes at a different pace. And I think that, you know, often if you're the CEO or the founder or someone who's kind of come with this invitation, you've been reading books maybe, or you've been, you know, had a spark of inspiration, you've been thinking about it for a while, but often the people around you are just now hearing about it. And when we hear about something that's sort of like, you know, in a complete other paradigm, I think it's natural for people to be a bit skeptical or kind of wonder like, you know, I can't picture it. What does that look like? And so I think like the practice of listening and slowing down and really asking questions, like it seems like there's a lot of hesitance or skepticism, like let's talk about that, and creating spaces for people to kind of express those concerns and for them to be okay, rather than to be seen as like a nuisance or slowing it down or ignorant or not being progressive enough. That, you know, everyone is starting from a different place. So I think Chuck Blakeman had this great quote that don't announce self-management and then say, I'll be on the golf course. Like there's a lot of work to do, I think, in terms of like holding the space and making it safe for people to explore all of the feelings they have about that. And, you know, what do we think about this? Like, how do we see this journey? Like, I think that's really important.
Yeah. And to speak to that question of psychological safety that's in the chat, it's I've come to learn that bringing in a culture of listening is kind of goes with self-management. And because just the idea of being heard creates the safety to then move to the next things of making proposals and taking initiatives. But being heard is like a baseline condition, and that, you know, it's not the most sexiest thing you want to be bringing in, right? Or we're going to bring in like a better listening culture. So just that, I mean, I never underestimate just like starting to do good check-ins with your team, and so people can show up authentically. I don't know who it was, Susan, you shared it with me, somebody who was doing check-ins for like a full year until they started doing like showing up authentically in check-ins instead of trying to be something in the check-in. It's like it's a lot of unlearning for the expectations that the work world has put upon us to all of a sudden be feeling safe enough to show up authentically. And so that idea of building that listening and being authentic culture is not a given, especially with so much of the stuff people have experienced in organizations.
Yeah, totally. And, you know, one of the things that's a little bit confronting when leaders or founders are first starting to talk about the possibility of, you know, myself or organization greater than accompanying them on this journey is that it takes, in my experience, it takes about a year for the organization to adapt, right? For it to be able to fully relax into this new way of being, and knowing, like you said before, like, oh, this is not just like the latest book that the CE's read and she's going to change her mind next month and be on to something different. That this tentative unlearning and relearning and the organism itself adapting to this new way of being takes time. So that I think I often see this impatience of like, how is this going to change? How am I going to see it? And the answer is it will change and you will see it, but it's complex and we can't predict it in advance.
I still have, like, even though it's been years I've been in this, I still have these, like, the narrative in my head, because from this idea of, when you're functioning more self-managing, there's times where you lean out and give space to other people, and then there's times where you lean in and you really like offer your strength and your gift for the collective purpose. And so knowing when there's the lean out and the lean in, it's years, and I still have questions on this every single day. Just this morning I was like, oh, there's a meeting. Oh my gosh, should I be in there? Should I just be leaning out? Da, da, da. And so just doing like, oh, can we just have a little touch point next, in a couple of days? And if there are any questions. So kind of being proactive, offering a space, but not, it is a journey, I think, for each of us on that path. And it depends as well. I was the founder in Percolab, so that journey's been like really noisy in my head and heart, I think, too. And it's gotten easier and easier with time, but never goes away.
Yeah, it's like something around both awareness of what's actually happening in the relational field and the discernment. It's something that never necessarily, maybe it gets a little bit smoother, but it never goes away.
Yeah, I think that for me is like a message that's really resonating with me recently is like how much we tend to like idealize people who come across as like enlightened gurus, and actually I'm realizing that the companies that are practicing self-management and these new ways of working really effectively, often the leader is someone who is not that at all, but really humble and vulnerable and sharing, like I was on this seminar this morning with this CEO of a Finnish company, and he was saying how he's all the time like trying to be aware and say out loud, like, okay, now I stepped in too quickly, or, and he has lovely little practices like to stop himself from automatically jumping in and solving problems when he sees something that needs to be addressed. He just sets himself a reminder for 1 to 2 weeks time. And then often he says it gets solved anyway, and he didn't need to step in. But if not, it kind of gives him just that sort of space, that breathing space to sort of check in, be aware, be conscious, like, do I want to step in? Is this the right moment for me to step in and in line with the purpose? Or should I maybe kind of step back or sort of ask a question or, do something else? And I think like that for me is really, really interesting, that it's not that, we talk a lot about these sort of skills and kind of key abilities and ways of being, but I also want to convey that it's by no means that you have to be expert at this or like have it all figured out. Like, I think the best thing you can do is when those little oops moments happen is to make it a learning moment, right? And say, oh, whoops, like, I stepped in too much, or I stepped back too much, or, here's what happened. And then let's talk about it, like, and like, let's be co-supporters in this sort of development journey and kind of role modeling that, because I think everyone's development just goes on a massive like accelerated boost when you start practicing this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. There was something else in the chat just that I wanted to pick up on, acknowledging power and power dynamics. And when what you just described, Lisa, is happening from the founder or the person that previously held all the power, the modeling of that, there is something unique and is going to be paid attention to maybe more, and acknowledging that this, just because we say we're self-managing doesn't mean that all of our power structures are dissolving before our eyes. No, because power is something that we have learned, that has supported us, that keeps us in our places of self-identity and self-acknowledgement, understanding what type of power you utilize most, and trying to figure out how to name that in a way that doesn't pretend that it's just gone away.
I think, and it relates to this other question there that's around strategy, but I think the thing for me was the shift when it was like realizing that I might have taken on this notion of like power is a scarce resource, and then flipping it to this idea of abundance. So it's like, can I claim my power and can I share power? Like, it's not an either or, it's both, right? And so claiming my power means me being much more self-aware of what are my strengths that I have to give. So if my strength is strategy, I should be offering my strategic vision to the organization. And if my strength is not strategy, then I shouldn't be offering strategic vision to the organization. It gets complicated because people give more value to strategy than something else, right? So part of my journey is like, at first I stepped out of strategy, and then is like, and so it's like, oh, it's okay to see things strategically and to bring that in to the organization, but without, it's like, here's what I'm seeing, here's some consequences, here's some possibilities. I think I recommend, this is what I'm seeing. And then it's a collective decision, right? In the appropriate collective decision space. So when I understood it more of this is my strength, and to claim that strength while sharing, it shifted it for me. It's like an and space.
Yeah, I think that's also the trap, when many people read like Reinventing Organizations, for example, the trap of green, that we end up in this like buddy culture space where we think everyone needs to be equal. Anything that resembles hierarchy or leadership is evil. And, no, we must all be equal and we must all decide everything together. And I think for me, a big learning edge has been realizing, like, as you say, Sam, like recognizing that abdication is also dysfunctional, right? And hierarchies are not in themselves evil or bad, that we want to create the conditions for leadership to kind of flow where it needs to go and for it to be dynamic. And I think part of that is creating clarity about roles, being aware of our strengths, having conversations, making power and influence visible. So I think, trying to eliminate hierarchy. I remember when I started this journey out, when I first started talking to both of you, 5 years ago or so, I was very much of the mindset that hierarchy is bad. We must smash down all the pyramids. And I think now I'm realizing like, oh, okay, hierarchy is neither good or bad. It's a technology, you could say. And I think all groups of humans have hierarchies. And if we try and push away something or reject something, it springs up anyway somewhere else. So it's better to aim for kind of conscious dynamic hierarchies, I think. And so I think this leadership piece, which for me ties into this like adult to adult thing, that, self-management doesn't mean like bossless doesn't mean leaderless, and self-management doesn't mean everyone gets to do what they want. For me, it means this paradox, but this beautiful kind of synchronicity of accountability and psychological safety. It's both, so that means like holding each other to account, but with love, and that's like, we have no concept of that because we don't learn that in school. We certainly don't learn it in workplaces. So it's really a whole new thing.
And you go. I love the love that you're saying, love.
Yeah, and just acknowledging all of those things and taking the time to really, really come up with a bit of a plan, right? Like it doesn't just happen, right? Like the unique supporting structures for your organization are going to be unique to your particular situation and the people who inhabit it. But emergence happens in a couple of ways. If you set up some boundary conditions and some scaffolding, because you've seen that when I do this, this is more likely to happen. This pattern is more likely to repeat. That's one approach you can take, right? You can take the approach of, we're just going to let it go and see what emerges over time. But that can take a lot of time, and it might never happen, right? So again, don't be afraid to have a plan of actually putting experiments in place, putting some boundary conditions in place, even potentially deciding that for the first part of the journey, having some hierarchical structures in place could actually be in service of what needs to emerge for your particular organization.
I have this this moment where a new colleague came into the organization, and she called me up one day and she said, "Hey, Sam, is it okay if I do this?" And I was like, wow, she's calling me to get like the okay for doing something. And I was like, oh, really? I said back to her, what would you need to know to be able to make that decision on your own? And I thought that was the healthy question for me to be shifting in my practice, instead of taking it on and giving the answer. What do you need to know? Or what would you need to to be able to go and seek out for information in the organization that you can make that decision on your own? And she said, well, I need to know this. And I said, okay, you don't have access to that? Okay, because that is in somebody's head because it's a historical piece. And of course, everybody who's there now knows it, but somebody who's new doesn't. And so then of course we made that clear. And I love it when a new person comes in the organization and has a reflex of asking if it's okay to do something. And then we get to do a little bit of cleaning, just a little bit of tidying up for that.
Absolutely. And this goes to, there's been a few comments in the chat about so much that we need to unlearn and relearn. And there's so many layers of that. And I think that one kind of aha moment for me was this work is not something that you're going to go and do a 2-week offsite and learn and come back and try to apply it to your organization. This is something that the workplace is the perfect fodder for us to do this growing and learning. There doesn't need to be this a conflict or a compromise between continuing to get great outcomes for your organization and doing this work together. Every time we have a meeting, we have a chance to practice so many things that might be at our learning edge. Everything from mine is always being clear and concise, right? Every single meeting, I get a chance to practice that. Scanning the room together and ensuring that everybody has a chance or equal or equitable access to the middle, and that we're taking enough time for the conversation to actually do what it needs to do. Lisa, I'd love to hear from you an example of where the workplace has provided the fodder for your both either or personal or professional growth.
Yeah, I think it's funny because one of the threads that I'm really interested in at the moment is conflict transformation. And I really like using the word transformation instead of resolution, because I think that is this mindset shift that conflict is not something bad or something to be suppressed, but something that on the other side of it are great opportunities to deepen relationships, to get new understanding. They're just inevitable, like in groups of humans. So how funny then that I'm the most conflict avoidant person, and I like to be liked and I like harmony. And so it's been really challenging for me to kind of train in being okay with conflicts. And that means I'm quite comfortable with facilitating them, but the actual like me showing up in terms of my feelings, my needs has been really challenging. And some of my colleagues that I work with kind of lovingly support me. They say when I'm in this, I become like an amoeba, this kind of bland, like, okay, I'll go with the flow or whatever. And they're really longing for me to show up more. And I'm realizing that when I do that, contrary to my fears that, I will make things worse or I will be rejected, it really strengthens relationships. We get new perspectives. We often come up with different ideas, so I think that's been challenging for me and is kind of an ongoing piece. But I think like, we were talking before about psychological safety in self-management, and I think that's essential. And I think a huge part of that is learning to look at conflicts completely differently and relationships completely differently. That in a traditional organization, it's HR's job or your manager's job to sort those things out. Whereas in self-management, we're really asking people to really strengthen those muscles and learn new skills about when there's something going on in a relationship between me and any of my colleagues, like, getting the courage to go and talk to them about it, because that's important. Like that gets in the way of us being able to do good work. Like that is the work.
It is the work.
Yeah. So it's this funny, like, sometimes the universe delivers you things for your own development.
Mm.
I'm
some more of these kind of like really like practical, real examples of like what the challenges are and what are some of the things that you have found really kind of help you both get out of it when you're in it, but even some of the like, what are the early warning signs that you might see, and then maybe take a little sidestep to avoid the like big ditch of the hole.
Well, bringing up the conflict pieces, that's where the juice is, right? And I think that it's really easy to talk about structures and policies and all sorts of stuff, but the conflict piece it's the crux of it. For me, I've gotten to this point now where it's like circle dialogue. Let's talk about it. Let's practice it. Let's just like normalize it. And I use it now as much at work as in my personal life. It's been a gift to me because I've gotten so used to it. And it's just like, what's a question we have right now? So this little conflictual space, question that's constructive, that's inclusive, that's brave, that speaks to the heart of whatever's going on, doesn't avoid it, like goes into it. And then just having a little tool to go around with the speaking stick and or listening stick, depending how you want to name it, to go around one by one and just be heard and speak from what's going on. It just mind boggles me how us human beings, it's actually quite easy. We've been doing it forever. We know how to do it. It's natural in us. And for some reason, the workplace, we're never supposed to do it. And conflict stuff happens with hierarchy behind closed doors. And then it's like private. It doesn't get talked about. So we don't actually develop a collective skill or awareness or ease with this. Like what you're saying, Lisa, is perfectly, I think it's normal for most of us because workplaces didn't see that as something that we should be getting good at together. And what I love is on like a Saturday afternoon where I'm having like a juicy argument with my husband, and then we're like, oh, let's just go for a walk with a talking piece. And so we like go on out to the mountain, and one's got it, we got our question, and we walk, and by the time we get back to the car, it's resolved. And I'm like, thank goodness I work in a self-managing space that's given me the skill to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that conflicts will start to emerge in different areas when we start to practice this new way of working. And one example that I have, a practical example that I see time and time again, is around decision making. So oftentimes from a cognitive perspective, a shift to self-management is a reaction or an opportunity around how do we decentralize decision making? How do we gain the practice of giving decisions or making decisions at the right place in the system, closest to the people that are going to be impacted by the decision. And so there oftentimes is this really juicy energy early on around, let's use an advice process, or let's learn how to do generative decision making. But these processes and practices are not standalone. So one of the things that I see frequently is a practice of advice process without clear roles, and actually understanding from the perspective of purpose and accountability of a role, if there's a decision piece to that, so that we can start to circle around what advice process is in conjunction with roles. Because if you just throw an advice process out there and there's no clarity on where this decision sits within the structure, it can get very confusing. It can get very frustrating. It can become something that is definitely misunderstood and can also cause conflicts. So I think that I guess my point here is that we do really need to take the time to interrogate the puzzle pieces that we think that we know or think are going to allow us to practice with a full recognition of how this is going to impact the system, the new system.
Yeah, I think one of our colleagues, Helen Sanderson, for me articulated in quite a useful way, like 3 really fundamental practices you can use in a team that I think give you a pretty solid structure for navigating some of the things we're talking about. So the first is creating team agreements. Like, how do we want to be together? Like, how can we do our best work together? And really having those be something living that you actually hold each other to account on, where you like revisit it, once a month, or and say like, hey, I feel like we're not living this one or that one. And there are some good tools for doing that, like confirmation practices where you can actually score it and like do something about it. So team agreements. And then the second one is, how do we decide how to decide? So what you're talking about, Susan, I think so many tensions and conflicts arise out of that someone decided that and they didn't involve me, and I have like valuable things to offer on that. Or, they didn't consult that person who had valuable expertise and could have said, well, you can't do that because this and this. So how are we going to decide how to decide? And then to do that, I think you need clear roles. So transparent, clear roles. Like, who can make what decisions in what roles? Where do we need to consult someone? What are our kind of guardrails for decisions about certain things? And so those three things together, team agreements, decisions, roles, I think start to create a bit of a framework for, okay, so we have at least some basic things of how we can say, well, hang on, you made that decision without consulting me in this way or whatever, and that goes against this agreement, or how that's not clear, we need to make that we need to agree that or get a shared picture of that.
Yeah. These are all like things, when I hear the question in the chat about external pitfalls, and we're talking about like organizations that go self-managing, but there's tons of organizations that aren't going self-managing. They're just bringing things in. We're working a lot right now with public health. Public health is not going to go self-managing, right? It's a huge government structure, but within teams and different areas, there's all sorts of more collaborative and caring processes that really are coming from self-managing movement, right? So bringing in consent-based decision-making as a way to collectively make decisions that there's an efficiency and a productivity and a flow to it, and a collectiveness and a care in it, and all voices being heard. It's like picked up just like that, and it's really making impact. So it doesn't necessarily have to be like the whole organization or even announced as such. I don't even think it would be helpful in certain spaces you use the term, but saying, how can we make decisions together better or more clearly, or adding a decision log, like, so simple, and just, where can I go? Everybody can go to the decision log and see what's been decided, and keeping track. Something so basic as that, I think, is an oversight for a lot of people. But in our work with public administrations, just like these little things get picked up so fast. And I love one of the directors we've been working with. She said to me the other week, she said, it's not that I wasn't a good manager before. I was an excellent manager, very productive. All our work was getting done. It's just I was miserable and my team was miserable. So now we're still doing excellent work and we're joyful.
Absolutely. I'd love to hear, Samantha, you talk a little bit about the collective reflective practice. I think that one thing that I've learned from you and always admired you for, and I feel like something you're always pushing me to do, is both an individual a reflective practice, but a collective reflective practice. When we are, when there's not one person deciding what to do, right? All of us are seeing different things. Everybody that's in the system and the organization is seeing something different. I'd like to hear a little bit about what you've learned and why, in your experience, it's so important to take the time to really grow our muscles around having a collective reflective practice.
I'm wondering if you can think of a specific example that comes to mind when you're thinking about that for me.
I mean, I'm thinking about anything. I'm thinking about business strategy, for example. So if our organization is doing consulting and training, and different people are doing different types of work, taking the time for everybody to come in and talk about the external work in relation to how the internal organization is supporting that, or amplifying certain things, or dampening certain things. When we're in complex adaptive systems, like any workplace, one of the, I think, skills that we need to learn and practice is this idea of collective scanning, collective sensing into what we're seeing.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I almost take for granted now that we do a lot is like we'll be in a meeting together on, you know, whoever, whatever, however long, and it's like this kind of go around of like, what are we noticing that's going well, and what are we noticing that needs to be tended to, and just like hearing everybody speak to that. And then just having a moment, like if you just harvest the key words and then you just have a moment of silence and looking at that and going, okay, then what would make sense that we work on for the next hour or two? And it becomes clear, like you don't need to have the agenda. There's something about just asking those open-ended questions about, or you know, what's something that's really, you know, functioning clear, that's clear on this topic or this question, and what's something that really needs to get some clarity, right? Spaces like that we don't offer ourselves all the time, because we're always like problem solution. We're this in-between space of just like a proper go around where everybody's just heard, nothing's discussed, of saying, you know, what's clear and what's not clear for me, what's clear, what's not clear for me. So much collective wisdom comes out of that. And then, yeah, we were working with a client the other day, and somebody just asked a question, and straight away they were going to go in for a solution. And I was just like, can we just do this go around? And it's the insights that came from the one to the other. And then it was like turning to the original person and saying, would you like another go around? And she was like, yeah. And had like a second go around. And then it was like, do you have your clarity? She says, yeah. Like, what needs to be done now? It's clear. It's this. But yeah, how do we bring in those practices? I don't know. It's just, there's a little, it's proposing it and then just holding the space for it, right?
Yeah, I mean, Lisa, you know, we bonded over our love for liberating structures, and I think this is one of the ways. But I'm looking at Ruta's question in the chat, and this idea, and I really just felt my heart leap a little bit when I read that when we're inviting new systems, that some people might react as in a really strong way. Like maybe oppressive is maybe a strong reaction, but how do we actually, or what are the things that we can do to help people decide, keeping on inviting people and helping them decide for themselves if this is the way that they want to work?
Yeah, I think I speak to a lot of people who start off going like really enthusiastically in with holacracy or sociocracy, and a lot of people find it really useful, and a lot of people find it difficult. It's a lot to kind of get to grips with, and I think there's no one size fits all, so I think it's not for everyone. And so I'm kind of suggesting this also with, you know, a pinch of salt, because there's many other ways to it. But I do like the idea you know, that comes from the Ready about like starting with like what's getting in the way of our best work, and sort of seeing like what are some common pain points, and like if we took one or two of those and started to reinvent it or explore it in line of something that's maybe more transparent or more participatory, what could that look like? And maybe a working group springs up to go and look at, okay, let's look at decision making. What are some different ways that we could learn about different ways to make decisions, and could we test something and then see if that fits or not? So that, because I remember, Sam, when I interviewed you for the podcast a couple of years ago, you said something that stuck with me about like it is difficult for people to step into nothing. You know, if you say, hey, we're doing this thing, there you go, and there's nothing, that's really challenging. So I think it is helpful to have, you know, to eat the elephant one bite at a time, and to have some little things like, hey, what would happen if we explored, you know, having like greater autonomy in teams? What could that look like? And finding some way to kind of start with where the energy is going. And I'm quite surprised, because like I saw someone talk about money in the chat there, and we're working with a client at the moment that like month one of the transformation process that we were helping them with was like, we want to go for self-set salaries. And I was like, whoa, okay, that's bold. And I sort of, said like, that's quite challenging. It's often something that is worth tackling when you have a bit more of a mature climate, but the sort of prerequisites seem to be there, and people really seem to feel like this is an important issue. And now it's kind of become quite a cornerstone in the organization, because it's so many things are kind of connected to that. And there was a big debate about, do we open up the salaries? And some people really, a small minority were like, I really don't want to open up salaries. And so it's been a process of like, okay, well, can we be okay with that? And can we support those people? And what would they need in order to open them up? And do we need to open them up? And so it's become this really ripe conversation. And now like a proposal has been launched. So the piece by piece, they're launching different experiments with the compensation process. And it's been really kind of powerful, and people are really seeing things shift. So I think a while ago, I might have said like, oh, I wouldn't start with salaries. But now I'm thinking, every organization is different, and you're starting from a different place with a different group of people. So
absolutely. And also there are some very clear pitfalls with doing salaries. It's assuming that everybody in the organization has a level of fiduciary acumen, right? I've seen organizations that go maybe too early to self-set salaries, and they're fielding proposals for salary increases where it's clear that there's not a real understanding of the actual fiduciary health of the organization. So I think that that would be one pitfall that I could strongly acknowledge, that if you're going to do that, ensure that everybody has what they need to have coherent context of the numbers of the organization.
I love the numbers piece, because it does bring you back to taking care of myself, taking care of others, and taking care of the organization. And so the way it's all run now is I don't get to see everything. So all I can do, it's inviting us to be very self-centered around our salaries. And I negotiate for me, and can I have more of that pie? And I don't even know how big the pie is, but like, can I have more of it? The whole system set up for that right now, right? So I was like you, Lisa, I was like, I'm going to wait a little bit before. And I was thinking organizations, it takes a bit of ripeness too, but I had the same experience very recently. A client wanted to start right off with that. Okay. And I realize it is because it is the cornerstone, because at the end of the day, like, there's monies going around, and are they being distributed in a way that's fair? And what is fairness? And is it something that you can write down, or is it something that's felt? And, how do we be in there in a way that's not just a bunch of individuals negotiating for self, but that actually have a caring for each other and a caring for the financial well-being of the company, right? There's a complexity. I know our practice of compensation as conversation is my absolute favorite practice in Percolab, but we are a lab. And so we are, committed to radical practices. But there's something so wonderful, like sitting down and we go, okay, here's the budget to distribute. And I don't just talk about how much I want. We talk about, what's the percentage that would be fair for each of us? And each of us has to add it up to 100% and then share it to the others, and why. And it's so hard, because when everybody puts their numbers down, it always comes out to more than 100%. And you have to tailor it back until it balances to 100. And then you're like, as soon as you have to do that, you're in all of the complexities that an organization has to function within. Yeah. And all of a sudden you're like, but that person did so much work. No. And so we just live with it's not, we accept it's not perfect, and we just do our best. And the being transparent about it, there's so much care in there. It surprises us every time.
It's funny, Samantha, it's also my favorite practice of self-management is in Greater Than we have conversations around money using inspiration from Charlie Davis's Happy Money Story game. And it has shifted so much for me personally. And I think so much for us as an organization to really be able to interrogate areas that is so far away from the possibility in 99% of the organizations on the planet. And there is something very uniquely transformational about actually talking about money and interacting with money in that way. I'm just noticing the time, Ella. So I'm wondering, do we want to take some questions? And I know that we can hang out for a little bit afterwards as well. Maybe we can unspotlight us and ourselves and have more of a conversation. But is there anything burning out there that you're seeing in the chat for us, Elena?
I've been writing them down and I think you've captured most of them. The only maybe slight addendum I'd like to bring up the money conversation is, what about organizations that are volunteer run that don't have that money in that piece? How does that play out?
Well, Lisa, we have a recent experience of this. Maybe you'd like to talk about it.
Yeah, we do. And do you know what? If there's anyone there in the chat that has, I know it came up in the chat, but if anyone else has examples of volunteer-based organizations that are doing this, people keep asking me that question. And I know a couple, but I think there must be more out there. And we've been working with an organization that's not only volunteers, but they're based all across East Asia. So there's so many challenges in terms of different cultures, and they have day jobs, so there's and they bring different skills and experiences and gifts, and so that brings a whole other dynamic. And in the case of this organization, there's huge levels of engagement and commitment to the mission of the company, which is amazing. But it is challenging to kind of get a grasp of like what are people's different experiences and skills that they're coming in with. And I think it's more challenging to, I think it can take longer as a process and can be more challenging in terms of like having a sort of core group of people that are able to do the work and are sort of coming and going a little less to kind of make progress and kind of build some foundations. And I've been speaking to people who are in volunteer-based organizations who are struggling with that also, when people are staying for a short amount of time. How do you onboard them into this way of working? Or how do you gauge, if people show up with lots of engagement, how do you make decisions about, well, who has the right experience or the right skills to be able to do this particular role? And especially if you don't have a lot of volunteers, then you're sort of grateful for any resource that you get, but at the same time, there is a kind of duty of care to the organization and quality and things like that. So it's definitely been a challenge and a whole other dynamic.
I guess in these last 2 minutes before we turn this into a bit more of an informal conversation, which can be a bit of a hazy end, I'd love to sort of pick up on this last question that Susan, you were picking up from Victor, which is like, what are the best ways that kind of allow you to have this both and world? And what is your version of that?
Yeah, it's easy for me to get into metaphor land. Like, I love the idea of a building code, right? So the building needs to have a sewage system. It needs to have fresh running water, right? It needs to have compliant electric. But within the context of those things that keep it compliant and keep it safe, there's lots of opportunity and room for creativity. And for me, it's not a one size fits all. So what building code for your organization might be different from the building code for my organization. But starting from that position, understanding what scaffolding we need for what needs to emerge to be able to emerge, I think is the first and best thing that any organization can do that is embarking on the journey. And even if you've been trying and playing at this for many years, revisiting that. And just, again, because systems become like water, right? Very soon we stop being able to see the systems that are either constraining or enabling us. And so to take the time regularly to interrogate those and name them. I was on a chat a couple weeks ago where somebody that was participating said we used to think about organizations from the perspective of, if you can measure it, you can improve it. Now, consider the idea that if you can name it, you can transform it. And I think that would be like sort of the beginning and end of my recommendation to anybody on this journey.
I saw that question in there about the couple of questions we ask somebody when we first start talking to them about self-organizing. And I think about that when I always ask, how are your team meetings? Because the way you meet as a team is pretty much a fractal of how your organization is functioning. And so you can get a reading of where it's at just from team meeting culture. And then the other one is like, yeah, what's your pain point going on? Something that's driving everybody crazy, because that's a low risk entry point. So to bring in flow. And the third one is how far are you willing to go in sharing profits and in shared ownership? Because that puts the level of the extent that somebody's really thought about it and is willing to go.
I'm kind of enthusiastic about someone asked a question about performance management, and maybe it also plays to this question of like these polarities of kind of compliance, creativity. And I'm really excited at the moment. I've been having conversations with, I've mentioned Helen Sanderson a couple of times, but with her and another colleague, Andy Brogan, who's developed a tool, a practice called confirmation practices, which for me, I think is really revolutionary actually in terms of how we do kind of accountability, performance management, feedback loops, both on an individual kind of role-based level and also on a team-based level. So I've been learning more about this and seeing examples of where, me in my role, I would have a regular practice with a colleague who would coach me, and every 2 weeks, I would look at a series of statements that would be true if things were going well. So it's kind of like a sniff test. So if I kind of walked into the organization, I could look at anyone's confirmation practices and get a sense of like, are things going well? So it might be things like, I feel confident that we're delivering products on time, or I feel confident that my colleagues would say I am reliable and like live up to my promises or whatever. So there's a process of you choosing the things that matter the most. And then every time you meet with your coach, you score it 1 to 5 on how confident am I, and it's deliberately subjective, and maybe all performance management is, right? But it's very explicitly subjective. It's like a gut feeling, like, well, I don't feel like I can put 5 because something in my gut is telling me it's not a 5, so it's a 4 or it's a 3, and then my buddy will coach me like, why is it a 4 and not a 5, or a 3 and not a 4, and what do you want to do differently in the next 2 weeks? And you can also do that with team agreements. Like if we have an agreement in our team that we're giving each other regular, adult to adult feedback, if we all score like 3 or 2, and we say, okay, well, we're not living up to that. What do we want to do about that? So it becomes this like actual thing. And they have used this in organizations that get accredited, healthcare, social care organizations that, really need to get accredited by external auditors who say like, okay, you need to tick this box here of like supervision. And Helen's organization said, we don't have supervisors or managers, but we have confirmation practices, and here's how they work. And they got an outstanding rating from this accreditor because they were like, this is fantastic. This is actually much more efficient than the top-down supervision thing, which does not create responsibility. It creates compliance at best, right? So that's something I'm really excited about.
Just keen that before I've seen some people drop off, we're over our time, but I just wanted to note that one of the great gifts of the time zones messing up last month was that Lisa and I came on anyway, and a few people joined us, and we just had such a lovely cup of tea, rich conversation with the people that hadn't got the memo that we were postponing, that we are going to be offering every month a self-management cafe. So around this time in the month, just go to the Greater Than Events page and sign up on the Eventbrite. But we really look forward to creating a space where we can just come and actually work on some of these very specific issues that we're seeing in our self-managing organizations, and also just connect and share what we're learning. Like, how can we expand this amazing triumvirate that is Lisa, Samantha, and myself to many more triads and groups of people, because the world is made small by Zoom. And I'm really looking forward to having a regular way to do this live and in person, as it were.
Beautiful. That's a great offer.
Thank you so much for that closing. I guess maybe we can go into slightly more informal conversations. I'd love to see if anyone wants to put their hand up if they've got any burning questions that we can kind of be less in like just the four of us up on stage type vibe. Maybe you've answered them all.
I've just taken my screen into gallery view, and I'm seeing all these beautiful faces that I recognize. So great to see you.
Christina, you've got your hand up. Would you like to?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, so here's the system that we use. We used to do for making some decisions. First, we need to know what needs to be decided, and like, or what, for example, what's the problems that we want to solve, which is the highest level problem? What are some potential solutions? And if the solution is like too big, like we can't afford this, what's a little smaller solution that would be a step in the right direction? And we did this in a series, first using SurveyMonkey and then using Google Forms. And now we're testing out Lumio. But I think my main question is, without having a person driving of going like a new quarter has arrived, we should probably ask what's going on. It feels like everybody's in their own little bubble, focusing on doing their work every day to organize this so that I'm doing that. So what would be a strategy to get it so that it's not just me at the team level? Sometimes there's like one person that organizes this at the team level, but then that's just dealing with like 5 people. It's easy. But once you start getting to the bigger level, like the big bubble that encompasses all little bubbles, it gets a little harder because everyone thinks, well, I know what's happening in my bubble. I don't really want to bother the big bubble. So maybe a good solution would be, or a good thing to test out would be to delegate this to somebody who would be like, oh, I'll do it. I don't care. So how does like, or like doing the machinations of government, how does that get so that it's not all on one person?
Any thoughts?
I mean, a couple of things coming up for me. Like one is, and maybe you've already done this, but like asking that question to the group of people, like sharing that, noticing that I notice that it tends to be me that sort of drives this, and there's some interest. And I'm wondering, like, I'm thinking back to what Sam said earlier when her colleague asked her, approval or permission for something, like what would people need to step in, and is there a group of people who would be interested in like co-holding this, or maybe it's like creating a small circle that contributes to that, something like that. Perhaps that's one thought that comes to mind.
True. It's just scary because people can do this when it's small, but once it gets big, it gets a lot more intimidating.
It's interesting. We've come up with like a vocabulary that's helped us to nuance some things. So we say, like if I'm involved in something, I'm not just involved in it. I'm either holding, I'm doing, I'm learning, or I'm coaching others to get better. And so being able to use those terms gives more nuance, because holding means I'm doing some stewarding. It's on my shoulders. Like it doesn't look like I'm doing anything, but holding is invisible, important work. And it's often the strategy and responsibility piece. Doing is what you see. That's the visible part. And learning, it's important to be able to name to the others when you're learning, because sometimes people can say to me, I want to start doing the holding, but I need to learn a little bit about the invisible stuff that the holding involves. So can I shadow for a bit, and you make explicit some of that holding pieces? And so there's a transition period for that as well. And I do think the holding, which is basically stewarding, no matter, however big or small it is, we don't necessarily have words around it, right?
And I think that, again, making the spaces for that collective reflection of noticing those things and naming them is just so important to elevating the opportunity space for actually noticing when these things are happening, because, we're human. Our days meld into the next. And yeah, creating the conditions for us to actually talk about these things and name them, I think, is one of the most important things we can do. Vaishak, you've got a question?
I do. But before we get into that, thank you so much for the conversation from today. I thought the bits on collective reflective practice and having an employee contract for accountability were particularly insightful. So my question regards the so I don't know. Please correct me if I'm wrong. So let's say an employee might have two goals. Like he or she may have an individual goal, which could be more like a career development based thing, and also a team level goal, right? So allegiance to whatever circle or team that they're part of. From what I understand, sometimes there's a bit of a mismatch in the goal, that some goals are prioritized above the other. And the team members might feel that in case somebody prioritizes the individual goal, that this person is not really contributing to the team at the level that they should. How do we address such an issue, or what could be factors here that you think that?
It'd be helpful if you could give a specific example, Vaishak. Can you think of something that we can kind of like get our claws into?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So let's just say this individual who works in engineering, right? And that person likes to design interesting things. And so every time there's a new opportunity to design a new component, this person is always let's do that, But then he or she never goes through completely with the task. So it's more of an excitement to jump into the task and take on something novel. But the rest of the team could be like, hey, if you're taking it, might as well complete it. Or why, like, can somebody else take this? Or so there's a bit of a pull in either direction. I hope that's a good example to put it into perspective.
I have a feeling Samantha has something to say about this.
Well, I'm channeling my colleague Stephanie, she always comes back to, know your strengths. So know where your strengths begin and end. And so when I'm hearing you from a strengths filter, I'm hearing somebody who's really good at like designing and developing and starting off. That's brilliant, right? If it's needed in the team, then it's a brilliant gift. And so if the person can be aware that the finishing is not their strength, then as a team, you can collectively deal with that. So by putting the two together, the person is confronted with both their strength and their weakness. And so then that's the problematic part, right? And so, yeah, it's like, how can we be seeing each other in our strengths and amplifying our strengths? And that's when everything's like in its highest potential in a team.
I think I think about Alana Irving's Full Circle Leadership, and maybe somebody can find a link to the great Medium articles that she's written about this. And the idea is that in any project or in any initiative, there is need for like that visionary energy, that synthesizing energy, that birthing energy, but also like the operationalizing energy and the optimizing energy. And if we can be in conversation around acknowledging any project or initiative from these perspectives, especially in a team, I can imagine that in the example that you're giving, Vaishak, the team can actually see, all right, this guy, that they're both his strengths and where his gifts lie are in this part of the circle that maybe is absolutely, well, it's definitely absolutely essential, but how we can orient the work around this and not feel that this person is always getting to do exactly what they want to do, but rather how is it in service of the team.
Okay. So basically convert that person's tendency into a strength of the team.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. Thank you so much. Lisa, are you going to say something, or I think I have my answer.
I also kind of have maybe to play devil's advocate. I also think that I notice sometimes in this like movement, people can become a bit kind of protective. And I think it comes from people caring about each other and, in service of creating more human organizations. I think sometimes the shadow side of that is that we start to kind of become a bit parental sometimes, or like I've had debates with people sometimes about like, you know, we shouldn't give people feedback, or, you know, we should only give people feedback on their strengths, or, you know, we shouldn't, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And I also think there is a value in giving each other, you know, again, it's this kind of like tough and empathetic paradox, like and a model I really like that I shared in the chat is Daniel Hoffman's core quality quadrant, which is not about trying to change someone or fix them or correct them, but to acknowledge that we all have like core qualities, and when it's too much of our quality, it also becomes our pitfall. And so if we can give each other feedback of when like, now you're sort of falling into that pitfall, and we can support each other to develop like a challenge, something that complements our qualities, so it's not that the quality is bad, but that perhaps there's another area to develop if that's interesting for the person. And to also have that kind of culture of feedback and honesty and mutual development, I think is worthwhile. So it's not like that we have to tiptoe around, you know, if something is not working in a team, like I think we can give each other feedback on that. And that's a really kind thing to do, so long as we're not kind of imposing our view. I really think feedback coupled with advice can be really toxic. But if we can give feedback and then have a coaching conversation, I think that can be really powerful.
Okay, thank you for your perspectives. I think that is pretty helpful.
Long live feedback culture. AAA, we talk about what do I appreciate, what do I want to amplify, and what do I want to adjust. And I love it. We're like, I'm at the point where I could just be here. If one of my colleagues is watching this, I would turn around afterwards and say, hey, can you give me a AAA on what just happened? And I'll just get a little hit, and it just feels so good. It's like continuous improvement made easy.
And I'm just naming that my body is tingling all over because I've got a significantly different perspective on feedback from the two of you. And that's amazing, right? Maybe we'll talk about this in a future call or in one of our cafes.
So curious.
So Ella, are you going to wrap us up?
Yeah, I think it's probably time for us to close. Thank you guys all so much for joining us today. Thank you so much to you, Samantha, for joining us from Canada, Susan from New Zealand, and Lisa from Barcelona. I'm sure we will be continuing these conversations, and that this is really just the start. And yeah, thank you so much for joining, and we'll be putting up some more of these webinars coming soon. So stay tuned. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody. Hope to see you at